Oh, yeah.
God, I can't get the plug out.
Yeah.
Amazing, thank you so much. So that was really interesting, Prashant, thank you so much. So next we have Johnny Wilkinson, who probably doesn't need that much of an introduction, but he's a consultant in intensive care medicine and anaesthesia in Northampton at the moment, and he's going to talk to us about de-resuscitation, essentially. Is that right, Johnny?
Yeah, kind of is, yeah.
Kind of is,
yeah,
okay.
that kind of thing. Morning, how are you all feeling, all right? Any hangovers in the room? Hands up. Oh, that's disappointing, isn't it? Well, there we go. Right, so there's lots of things going to be moving around on the screen here, so apologies. If you're not feeling sick now, you may be by the end. Right, so I'm going to talk about everyone's love, which is diuresis, okay? We're all a bit obsessed with it, removing fluid, because we all know that outcomes are poor for intensive care patients if they're in a fluid overload state of any variety. And the FACT trial, which is Fluids and Catheters trial in 2006, pretty much demonstrated that the outcomes from acute lung injury and or leading on to ARDS were better in the patients who'd had less fluid. However, what happened in this trial is, within the appendix, it was noted that the patients who were diuresed were only done after their shock state had resolved, and that's really important, so that's after the shock state's resolved. Because actually diuresis is not very well tolerated on vasopressors, so therein lies a slight problem. Because sepsis, as we all know, and I'm not going to tell you this because you're all more intelligent than me, is a panendothelial dysfunction, which is exactly what you tell your 4-year-old when they ask what it is, of course. Right, so as I've said, we're obsessed with lots of things. We're obsessed with drying everybody out. However, there comes a problem, because we tend to overdo it, and you get this azotemia, that means dehydration, and hyponatremia, and a metabolic alkalosis can develop. So these things are all the kind of thing we obsess with, and then we go chasing it with too much fluid to try and resolve the damage we've done. Apologies for the slide here, but this fella is very, very popular on YouTube. He does all sorts of stupid things, but he's here for a reason, because it's all a fine balance. So we want to achieve a negative balance, maintain an ideal plasma volume, and we're going to try for natriuresis. He's great, isn't he? I wish I could do that type of thing. And no dyselectrolytemia at the end. So we don't want to overdo things and cause a worse situation. But I need to tell you that we are very Neanderthal still, for various reasons. It depends who you are. But we are salt retainers. We do not want to get rid of salt. So that bag of crisps you eat, you can guarantee about 2 weeks later the salt will have been removed eventually, but the fact is we hold on to it and we really do not want to let go of salt. And therein lies the massive problem. Because when you have an operation or you get sepsis, it is a posterior pituitary gland, before we go any further, it secretes antidiuretic hormone. And this is a defense mechanism for when your arm was bitten off, you don't want to bleed out and be unable to climb a tree to escape the saber-toothed tiger, so we want to retain circulating volume. So we retain water and with it some salt, but we do this in excessive amounts with surgery and with stress. And the kidney does some other funky things, because what happens is we also secrete aldosterone and cortisol, and here's a drawing of the nephron. I'm sure you could do that in your sleep, but here it is. And what happens is we retain salt and we draw fluid into the system to maintain circulating volume. This is what happens in heart failure, and it shouldn't be this way, but it is because of the Neanderthal reflex. Edema in heart failure is a real oxymoronic state, and we pee out potassium. So come on, salt, see you later, potassium. That's the way things are. You get a boggy, hypokalemic patient post-op or in sepsis. So probably we should be focusing a bit more on salt removal rather than diuresis. Now, I think we kind of think these terms are interchangeable, but they're not strictly. Because we want to improve ARDS outcomes, less acute lung injury, shorter length of stay, and less patients looking like Michelin man or woman, or whatever's in between there, from the unit. And hyponatremia. Now, the problem is here, we tend to give excessive amounts of salt in all the IV fluids we give, unless you're very sensible using plasma-like Mentalite, but we all have an elevated total body sodium. It's usually 100 millimoles, most patients sitting at 150 up to 200. So there's just too much of this stuff in the circulation. So why don't we remove it? So I'm going to tell you about the kidney. And again, this is probably something you can all draw at the bar when you're having a chat with everybody, I'm sure, but we're going to look at the nephron again, because I need you to know a couple of things that are quite important. It's regarding the anatomy of the nephron. This was something that was taught really well at Liverpool Med School. Basically, they said, if you don't understand this, guys, I apologise, just learn it for the exam. And that didn't make any sense to me. But then, there we go. You've got Bowman's capsule at one end, you've got the proximal convoluted tubule, And now the loop of Henle comes in to play because that's quite important. And lucky for you, I'm not going to talk about the countercurrent multiplier because I'm sure, again, you all know about that. Then you've got the descending limbs, ascending limbs, and descending the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct at the other end. And these things penetrate quite deep from cortex into the inner medulla of the kidney. And that's as detailed as I'm going to get because I'm from Newcastle. So there you go, that's the nephron. Now, this is a really nice infographic I nicked from somewhere, and apologies, I can't give any credit. It's probably Michael, can't pronounce that surname there, but a guy from Poland who's done this extremely good drawing. Don't worry about all that because I'm going to show you it in a second. So let's focus on what goes on. So we obviously filter out through, and things pass through all the way to the collecting duct, and various very funky and exciting things happen. But let's focus on the proximal convoluted tubule and tell you what that does. So essentially this thing, which looks like bowel, but it isn't, we mainly reabsorb, pretty much everything gets reabsorbed already as it passes through a couple of micromillimeters or microns of this tube. And it's quite clever because it's keeping all the things that are valuable to us back through. And then we move on to the loop of Henle, and this is where we plough in lots of very popular diuretics, and they have various functions. But the thing I need you to know about this is that as fluid passes down the descending limb, water can get out, but it can't get back in. Sodium cannot get out of this thing. So what you're getting here is an increasing concentration of sodium as you go down, and because water penetrates out but doesn't go back in, that rises quite significantly. But then it seems a bit stupid, this, having that already happened. Sodium can then get back out, but water can't. So we then redilute. So at the end of the circuit, we're getting a dilute urine. And of course, that sodium's going, see you later, I'm not coming out here, and it's staying in the system. So another 25% or so of sodium is reabsorbed there again. So you can see here that sodium, it's a real bugger, and it's hard to get rid of. And even in the distal convoluted tubule here, have a guess what's reabsorbed there? Yep, there's some more sodium, and it comes out along with water, which cannot get back out either. So we got dilution of urine, and that's the key to this. Dilution of urine by the end, retention of sodium, and then variability in volume we pass out, whether you're in the desert or you're, I don't know, in Iceland. So 5 to 10% more sodium comes out there. And that's all I want you to know about this at the moment. I've got 3 minutes 50 now to get the rest of it done. So the collecting duct, this is complicated because you've got two types of cell that I want you to know about. The first is the principal cell, and what that does is it, under the influence of ADH and aldosterone, causes, have a guess, sodium to be reabsorbed. And it does so under the influence of those hormones, as we saw in the previous diagram, and you wee out your potassium again. And with the sodium should come the reabsorption of some water. And then the final type of cell is something called the intercalated cell. And there's an action here of another one, it's aldosterone again. But what aldosterone does this time here, and this is very important to remember, is we exchange hydrogen ions for potassium, therefore technically acidifying the urine. Right. Here's where you want to know what I'm going to go on about with this JICS mix thing. Carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, they're one type of diuretic. The loops that everybody knows about. The thiazides, you've got potassium-sparing diuretics, and then you've got the osmotic diuretics. So I'm going to show you how they all work in 2.5 minutes. Right, so this is that proximal convoluted tubule again. We're going to talk about carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. And I think these are slightly underused on ICU. And what happens here is, in normality, we get exchange of hydrogen ions for sodium in a symport mechanism, and then via active transport, you get sodium-potassium exchange. So again, sodium is getting back into the blood. Now, what happens here is you've got formation of bicarb sitting in there. That meets up with your hydrogen ions, forming carbonic acid, catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase, which then causes release of water and CO2. And we know CO2 diffuses into almost anything, so it goes back into the cell, says higher to the water, carbonic anhydrase hits again, you've got carbonic acid formed again inside the cell. Now this is where it gets clever, because you then exchange back out your hydrogen ions, and we get bicarb going into the blood, because this is maintaining our blood pH. These diuretics switch that off, so we're left with passage of bicarb out and effectively alkalization of the urine and passage of sodium. And it also, due to that fact, acts as a bit of a diuretic, but it will cause your pH to fall, giving you a mild diuresis, and it will drop your potassium. 1 minute 28. Here is the loop. Here's the ones we all love. So you've got 2 chlorides, sodium, potassium, sitting in there, and that all gets filtered in via inactive mechanisms, and via active mechanisms, this is what we're left with. So we're left with sodium, again, back into the blood, chloride, and a bit of calcium and magnesium at the bottom. Potassium stays in. What loops do is switch off that receptor, so we're left with this state. And you can see some sodium remaining behind and a few other electrolytes, and we get our diuresis that way. Now we get on to these, the thiazides, that we tend to associate with the elder spectrum of the population, but we've got sodium and chloride coming through here in normality, and then active exchange, again, sodium and chloride being retained in the bloodstream. These switch that one off, so we're left with a state where we've got more sodium and chloride retained in and a diuresis. That way, and carbonic anhydrase inhibitors tend to be the ones that do the least diuresis as far as urine output goes. Potassium sparing, then we're almost there. I've got 20 seconds now. I'm going to overrun. We've got the action of aldosterone here, which acts on the active pump, exchanging sodium and potassium off together with a bit of chloride back into the bloodstream, reabsorbed. These switch that off, therefore we're left in a state whereby we have less of that going on, more sodium in the collecting duct, and a diuresis that way. And finally, we all remember osmosis. So this is where we get passage of water through a semi-permeable membrane from an area of low to higher concentration of solute. As demonstrated here, water wants to go across and dilute the situation, swings around the other way when we have a different situation in the cell. So water's going to go from left to right, diluting things out. Now, what we can do is provide into the bloodstream things like mannitol, which are osmotic diuretics, effectively causing an osmotic shift and drawing in a fluid into the collecting duct, and actually with an increase in plasma and circulating volume initially, and a big diuresis, and lots of shenanigans with electrolyte problems if you overdo it. So to put it all together, I'm now on minus 40 seconds, but Prashant overran a little bit. He was on minus 40 as well, but I'm going to overrun even more. What's the JICS mix? This is Craig Morris and John Plum. They produced this paper, and they used a combination of all of these diuretics. Furosemide, we all know. Infusions, there's no evidence saying infusions any better than split bolus dosing. Aminophylline, I think, is slightly underused. So not only do you get smooth muscle relaxation via PDE3 inhibition, increasing cyclic AMP, you get a diuretic effect with it, chronotropicity and inotropicity, but acetazolamide, a great one. If you notice you're alkalotic, you need to remove fluid because you can alkalinize the urine, but be careful. If you happen to dip the urine and get a pH above 8, it's not going to work anymore. And then Spiron and Lactone. If you want to scan that QR code, it will take you to that fantastic paper, and it is worth a read, and fair play to Craig and John Plum for producing that, because this recipe, if used correctly, works really nicely, and you will notice you get far less electrolyte swings when it's monitored properly, versus furosemide that we all plough in and we then go chasing our backsides to try and correct the damage we've done. And that's it. That's the JICS mix, and I hope you natriurese rather than diurese in your practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Johnny is happy to be tweeted any questions at Wilkinson Johnny is his tag on Twitter.